two very different eras, but very vivid pictures. And so now we'll switch subjects, and Priscilla Gonzalez will talk about domestic workers.
Good evening. How's everybody doing? I can't hear all these women. How's everybody doing? All right. So thank you so much for having me and bringing the voices of domestic workers into this wonderful, wonderful event. As Kate mentioned, I'm with Domestic Workers United, which is an organization of nannies, housekeepers, and elder caregivers who, over the past decade, have been organizing for power, respect, fair labor standards, and to help build a movement for change. And for our organization, it's really significant to be here celebrating the gains that women have made, from demanding recognition to making policies that enable people to live with dignity. And all of that has enabled us to come a long way in our society. And it's been women who've been leading that charge, as we've heard from everyone who's spoken today. So I'm happy to be here to share our story about how we've been organizing in the domestic work industry and how women, and immigrant women in particular, and more recently immigrant women of color, have been changing the course of history. So I joined DWU almost 8 years ago because my mother has worked in the industry in New York as a nanny and as a housekeeper for over 25 years. And so she's been part of the thousands and thousands of women from Africa, Asia, Latin America, and the Caribbean who every single day get up to go to work so that their employers can go and do their work. They've migrated to the US because of so-called policies of free trade and structural adjustment, and other crises have made it impossible for them to live and support their families where they're from. And my mom has experienced a lot of the things that I'll be talking about: the long hours, the low wages, the abusive treatment. And I wanted to be part of putting a stop to it and actually working toward a vision, working toward implementing a vision that would make our industry, that would make this industry different. I want to start it by also telling you about a couple of our members. We have a member named Carolyn who has 3 children of her own. She leaves her home in the Bronx at 5 in the morning so that employers can leave theirs by 7:30 in the morning. And the night before, she's returned home to her own children at 10 p.m. Domestic workers care for the most important elements of their employers' lives: their families and children, often at the expense of time with their own children and families. And yet, in the isolation of their employers' homes, behind closed doors, they have been completely vulnerable and suffer some of the most terrible abuses imaginable: unjust firing, sexual harassment, rape, verbal abuse, and the list goes on. Another one of our members, Marina, worked for a couple out on Long Island where she cared for a child with special needs. She also did all of the cooking and cleaning, ironing, and washing in the house, responsibilities that were added after she had been hired, and there was no conversation about these additional responsibilities, nor was her pay adjusted to reflect that. She often worked 18 hours per day as a live-in domestic worker, and her sleeping quarters were in the basement with no windows and where a broken sewage system routinely flooded, and she was earning $3 per hour. And this wasn't at the turn of the last century, it was literally 2003. After 3 years of working under these conditions, her boss called her in on her day off to fire her with no notice or severance pay. And her story wasn't and is still not an isolated incident. And the problem here isn't the problem of a few bad employers. There are over 2.5 million domestic workers in the United States, 200,000 of which are in the New York metro area, who've been systematically made vulnerable to these conditions. The work, which has been traditionally seen as women's work, has been devalued. And as a form of wage labor, it has been seen as Black women's work and now immigrant women's work, and as such has been excluded from key labor protections. Many of labor's victories, like the National Labor Relations Act of 1935, still explicitly excludes domestic workers by name. And if not explicitly, then other laws exclude them by default because the labor laws haven't caught up until recently to the fact that someone's home could be someone else's workplace. So the result in the industry is at best unsafe, insecure, low-wage work, and at worst, rampant exploitation. But domestic workers are rising up, and they're organizing, and they're winning. 7 years ago, domestic workers in New York set out to win recognition, rights, and protection under the state labor law. Hundreds of nannies, housekeepers, and elder caregivers gathered at the meeting hall of SEIU 32BJ in 2003, so now almost 4 years ago. They gathered to share their stories and discuss what it would take to change the industry. They envisioned a comprehensive set of standards that many of us in other sectors take for granted: a living wage, paid leave, notice of termination, severance, that would guarantee safety and security on the job and put this workforce on equal footing with other sectors. Standing on the shoulders of workers who had previously waged historic battles, like the ones we've heard before or just heard, domestic workers began what would become a 6-year campaign for the nation's first Domestic Workers' Bill of Rights. In the course of the campaign, we have built a base of almost 4,500 members, and our members are out there every single day on the trains, on the buses, in the parks and playgrounds, flyering, recruiting new members. They're signing up for our education and our organizing training programs, and we're fighting and getting justice for hardworking women like Marina. In the course of 10 years, and in the course of this campaign, we've won over $500,000 in stolen wages for domestic workers, all of whom have been undocumented, and who we've supported to break the silence around the abuse and exploitation in this sector. And the victory that I'll talk about now, the victory to pass the nation's first Domestic Workers' Bill of Rights, came out of great sacrifice, with workers losing days of pay to march, hold vigils, rally, and travel up to Albany to tell their stories and urge legislators to pass this bill, which stood as the only answer to the specific challenges that domestic workers face on the job. And it was a true movement effort. It's great to see actually a lot of people in this room who traveled with us to Albany and who marched with us in the streets of New York to make this happen. Unions, employers, faith-based organizations, students, a lot of Hunter students turned out over the years, many of them interning with DWU, community-based organizations, legislators whose mothers and grandmothers had been domestic workers, all joined together to lift their voices alongside domestic workers to make recognition, respect, and rights a reality. And we brought the power of our coalition to bear on August 31st of 2010, when Governor Patterson signed the New York Domestic Workers' Bill of Rights, which was the first time in the history of this country that domestic workers were recognized as real workers. The legislation establishes a floor for the sector where none had existed before. It guarantees paid time off, overtime, protection from discrimination, coverage under disability, and it also put forward the possibility of collective bargaining rights for domestic workers. And the struggle is not over, but we have made a significant step forward in gaining recognition under the law and bringing an entire workforce out of the shadows of slavery. The Bill of Rights is justice for generations of racial and gender-based discrimination. And we see these gains as important milestones. The domestic workers movement across the country is gaining ground, and actually across the globe. In 2007, we helped to form the National Domestic Workers Alliance. There are now 40 organizations in over 20 different cities across the country. In California, as we speak, the sister organizations are getting ready to introduce California's Domestic Workers Bill of Rights on March 30th, which is International Domestic Workers Day, so please mark your calendars. And we're also getting ready to negotiate with domestic worker unions and organizations around the world to negotiate the first convention on the right to decent work for domestic workers in June of 2011 at the International Labor Organization. So again, these gains are important milestones in creating the conditions for what we actually see as the beginnings of a new economy where we begin to shift our consciousness and our culture around care and around the meaning of human dignity and human labor and human value. For us, it's been really significant, particularly being here to talk about the Triangle Fire, because we've taken an opportunity organizationally and as a movement to take stock of how far we've come thanks to a lot of sacrifice. Loud back there. And we also take stock of the battles that are being waged on the ground in Wisconsin, Indiana, Ohio, where those battles are reminding us of the hard-fought and the hard-won victories and rights that we actually now have to fiercely defend and build upon. And domestic workers know all too well, having been excluded from a lot of those rights, and their families suffering because of it. So we understand that we have to continue, that we have to stand in solidarity with those workers in the Midwest and really across the world who are having their rights violated. And just to finish off, a lot of what we've learned just in the campaign for the Bill of Rights is that we realized that we weren't actually just fighting to get domestic workers covered under the labor laws, but we were also challenging the inadequacy of our current labor laws, inadequacy for everybody across the board. And that now is the time to revisit the laws governing our workplaces. They have to be reshaped so that we go beyond mere inclusion to actually reflect the ways in which our workplaces are changing and the composition of the workforce today. And with the current global economy, also we need frameworks and instruments that are international in scope. Just as an invigorated labor movement rose to the challenge of honoring the legacy of the 146 victims of the Triangle Fire, similarly, the victory of domestic workers and their allies, again, the unions, the clergy, employers, students, community groups, people from all walks of life, is a testament to the power of organizing, the leadership of women workers, and a burgeoning movement for a new economy that values human dignity, that values all forms of work. This is a movement, as I said earlier, that's creating the conditions for us to see how we're connected to one another and enabling us to create the conditions so that we create policies that actually reflect the real needs and hopes and dreams of working people everywhere. Thank you.
Thank you so much, and your perspective is so interesting because in light of the previous speakers, to hear what it's like to be this early in the stage is actually very enlightening, and we're delighted you were able to join us.